Hello and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast. My name's Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine, as well as the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome back Jonathan Gold to our podcast. Jonathan serves as Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation in Washington, D.C. In his role, John is a primary spokesperson and is responsible for representing the retail industry before Congress and the administration on supply chain, international trade, product safety, and customs related issues impacting the retail industry. While with NRF, he has been a leading advocate of the value of trade and global value chains to the United States economy. Prior to coming on board at NRF, John served as a policy analyst in the Office of Policy and Planning for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, also known as CBP. He joined CBP in May 2006 and was responsible for providing policy guidance on issues surrounding maritime cargo security and trade-related matters. He also worked on implementation issues surrounding the Safe Port Act and other issues within the agency, including CBP intelligence reform, pandemic flu, and trade facilitation. Before CBP, John spent nearly a decade with the Retail Industry Leaders Association, where he held several government positions, including director and then vice president of international trade policy, before being named vice president of global supply chain policy in January of 2005. He's also served on several government advisory committees, including the Department of Commerce's Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness, the Department of Homeland Security's Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, and also on the Department of Commerce's International Trade Advisory Committee on Distribution Services. John graduated from American University in Washington in 1994 with a bachelor's degree in international business with a concentration in finance. Hey, John, welcome back to our podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. As a side note, for those listening, John was our first ever guest on the Logistics Management Podcast almost exactly 5 years ago. And this is his fourth time on. So, John, welcome back.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get things started, John. Obviously, a big topic within the retail shipper world for more than a little while now has been tariffs and trade. Um, and this will be kind of a multiple part question, if you will, because there's so much to talk about on this one topic alone. And I'll kind of give you the ball in terms of where you want to start things, John. But there's so much going on. We look at the Supreme Court decision in February, ruling against the legality of the IEEPA tariffs implemented by the administration, the subsequent Section 122 tariffs that are still in place today, and refunds, obviously, from the IEEPA tariffs, and also the the ongoing Section 301 investigations for potential future tariffs. I mean, gosh, it's more than a few items there, but I mean, how do you sort of view all this within the tariff landscape and what it means for retail shippers?
Yeah, and Jeff, you also forgot about the ongoing 232 tariffs that are in place and
Oh my,
investigations that are continuing.
yes,
So
my
I
God,
think,
my
look,
bad.
to be honest, I mean, what you just pointed out just shows the ongoing complexity and uncertainty that retail and other shippers just continue to face as they're planning their supply chains. You never know from one day to the next what the tariff rate is going to be.
Yeah.
We certainly were happy to see the Supreme Court's decision with regards to the IEEPA tariffs that ruled that those tariffs were legal. It wasn't just the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs, but it was the tariffs that were on Canada, Mexico, and China on immigration and fentanyl related issues. It was the subsequent tariffs on India and Brazil. So we were happy to see that, but as you noted, right after the Supreme Court decision, the president then announced the global 10% tariff under Section 122. That's temporary. That lasts until the end of July. And while that's in place, we've got two ongoing 301 investigations launched by the Office of Trade Representative. We have the one on forced labor, which hearings are happening this week. And that targets 60 countries. Then we've got the one on structural excess capacity targeted at 16 countries, where that hearing is next week. And USTR is moving very quickly with those investigations to try and have those wrapped up in advance of those Section 122 tariffs expiring in late July. So, again, it's a lot of uncertainty for many companies who are trying to figure out, how best to plan their supply chains as companies are making their sourcing decisions, 6, 9, 12 months in advance. Not knowing what's going to happen in the future is extremely complicated. So it's just more uncertainty than I think folks, are trying to deal with at this point in time. We can
Yeah.
certainly talk about the whole refunds process if we want to get into that as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. Actually, let's touch upon the refunds now while we're sort of within our tariff bucket, if you will, John.
Sure. So, the refund issue wasn't explicitly part of the arguments before the Supreme Court. It was a one line of questioning that came up during oral arguments, but in the decision from the Supreme Court, they didn't touch the refund issue. They kind of pushed that back to the Court of International Trade, which moved quickly to work with CBP on getting them to do the refunds.
Yes.
CBP said they couldn't do it immediately, which was, the judge had said, immediately start pushing out the refunds. And CBP said, we can't do it immediately. We've got to go through this process. It can take us about 45 days to develop. And, they gave the judge updates. I think it was every 2 weeks they were reporting out on the status. And lo and behold, last week, CBP launched their CAPE process in ACE. And that's the process that you have to use to claim a tariff refund. They've got it marked in two different phases. Phase one, I think they said covers about 127 billion of the 166 billion that's being collected. And for the most part, things worked well last week when they opened the doors. There certainly was an initial crush of people filing their declarations in CAPE.
Hmm.
I think for the most part, folks got through that process. I did hear some companies had some difficulties with logging into ACE and spending a lot of time on customer support, but they were able to get those issues resolved. And I think throughout the week, things kind of smoothed out a little bit. And that was just the first step for companies to file for a refund, just putting your entry into the system and getting that to be accepted. Once that's accepted, then it moves along with customs, actually reviewing the entries and trying to figure out if there are any other issues beyond IEPA with that entry. They're going to pay very close attention to the classifications, rules of origin, make sure all your documentation is there to prove that you're due a refund.
Okay.
And CBP said that review process is going to take about 45 days, but the process in whole to get your refund is going to take about 60 to 90 days.
Oh boy.
So you know that's good for customs to have this process working. But again, we'll see how the next steps go as those reviews are done, and how companies get their money back, and whether or not any of that money is withheld for other issues with the entry beyond the IEPA, which I think is what everybody's kind of waiting for. And then we've got the kind of the phase two effort that we're all waiting to see move forward, which is some of those entries they think are more complicated, like things on reconciliation and drawback and things like that. So I think customs wants to get through this initial dump of the data and the phase and try and work through that, but hopefully working on this next phase to come, hopefully soon or sooner rather than later, so other companies can probably get their refunds back as well.
Okay. Yeah, great overview there. Thanks. So John, every month the NRF, along with maritime consultancy Hackett Associates, Ben Hackett and his team, put together the terrific port tracker report, which really, in many ways, for many supply chain industry stakeholders, sort of serves as a good benchmark or update as to where things stand when we look at what's happening on the import front. And touching upon obviously the different variables impacting import levels like tariffs, which we just discussed. Um, how are things shaping up for your next report? I know that in your last report you had indicated you had forecasted, for example, that April would come in at roughly 2.08 million TEUs for a 5.6 annual decrease with with the subsequent months also looking to be largely down too, in large part due to really difficult annual comparisons, obviously due to the myriad of tariff activity going on a year ago at that time. Um, how do you sort of view what's happening now, I guess, on the on the retail container trade front? And what could we be looking at in the coming months as it relates to the things that are typically communicated within the port tracker report?
Yeah, thank you for that. Ben and Daniel Hackett do a great job with putting together the global port tracker for us, and I think it's been hugely successful and has been kind of
Yeah.
on point with where things are. And again, it's kind of a forecast and
Yes.
a bit of a look back. So obviously, in trying to compare year over year has been extremely difficult, especially going back the past 5 or 6 years because there's been so many different issues impacting the supply chain. Whether it's the tariffs of last year, COVID, what have you. There's been some kind of incident that impacts the supply chain, labor negotiations, things like that. So trying to compare back over last year has been very difficult because you had a lot of companies who front loaded, prior to Liberation Day in April of last year, trying to get a lot of that merchandise in before the tariffs took effect. So, it really is to no surprise that we're seeing a bit of a dip in cargo, for the first half of the year.
Hmm.
We only predict 6 months out. So right now we're predicting out till, I guess late summer, and the kind of early fall. But, as of right now, we're still seeing numbers kind of on the downslope for at least the first half of the year. Uh, I think things might start to pick up again as we start getting into the peak shipping season, as we're looking at the holidays towards the end of the year. But, just to caution there as well is that, we don't see that huge bunch of what used to be known as kind of the peak shipping season, the holiday shipping season, where it was, August, September, October was everybody would jam everything in. That peak shipping season really has kind of lengthened out as consumers are starting to shop earlier in the year for holiday merchandise, and just also for ways for retailers and others to ensure stability within their supply chain, so that they're not bringing everything in all at once. So, I think again for the first half of the year, we're looking at numbers to be on the downswing and hopefully pick up a little bit towards the end of the year for the
Right.
holiday season.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about peak season, and honestly, going back to 2020 when COVID hit, it seems like how peak season is defined or viewed, etc., has really moved around a lot. Going back to the pandemic, obviously the numbers tell, as you indicated, that things are looking to be down largely, at least through August, based on your last report. With that as sort of a backdrop, if we were to look at the 2026 peak season, in terms of what could be in store, is it still too early to tell, or does NRF, do you have any type of baseline projection in terms of how you expect things to perhaps play out as it relates to peak?
So we don't have anything specific on peak, but obviously, we put out our sales forecast for the year uh, earlier. I think it was earlier this month, and obviously looking at positive sales growth this year. But that doesn't always translate with how kind of port tracker works,
Yeah,
and the imports they're a little bit different. But the hope certainly is that the consumer remains strong, as we've seen. Despite all the headwinds that the customers or consumers are facing, they're still
absolutely.
they're still spending. That's what our forecasts show and our economic data shows.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that's a nice segue for sort of some of the economic indicators kicking around out there. And the ones that are sort of top of mind that I'm thinking about are obviously inflation and retail sales. I guess we could sprinkle in GDP, maybe what's going on with housing, as obviously new housing starts are a big driver of retail sales too. What are some of the economic indicators out there, and we could throw gasoline, we could throw fuel in there too, obviously. But what are some of the ones you're keeping a close eye on at the moment? I guess from the perspective of the retail supply chain or the retail shipper.
Sure. So, I talked to our chief economist, Mark Matthews, about what some of those indicators are. And he said, our own data continues to show strong March retail sales. March was the sixth month in a row of month-on-month increases in retail sales. And, that seems counter to everything you're
Yeah.
hearing about, what you're hearing from the consumer. But despite soft sentiment, consumers continue to spend on retail goods. Obviously, the tax refunds in March exceeded last year's refunds by over $20 billion, spurring spending across discretionary and essential goods despite rising gas prices. Inflation remains elevated as tariffs and gas prices weigh on the cost of goods. So, despite headwinds, consumers still out there spending.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And obviously, everyone's been keeping a really close eye on what Federal Reserve interest rate. There's a new Fed chair likely coming in very soon. Um, how do you sort of view what may be in store as it relates to a new Fed chair coming in, as we view that the rate itself, and what it may mean for retail supply chains by extension?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize, if Warsh does get confirmed, which looks like he'll get confirmed by Congress. He certainly wants to lower the rates, but he's one vote on the commission. So,
Right.
many of the members still are aligned with Chairman Powell on rates and kind of the wait and see, especially with again the other headwinds that we're facing, and given that inflation continues to be elevated and gas prices remain high in the $4 plus range. It's hard to see how a near term impetus for rate reduction is going to happen.
Hmm.
Despite the ongoing pressures, but it's the economy's still in kind of a difficult spot. But we'll wait and see how things hopefully turn around soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had touched upon the Iran conflict briefly. Obviously, with it's had a pronounced impact on energy prices, specifically diesel, as it relates to freight transportation, and oil prices in general. How do you sort of gauge or assess what's the impact of the Iran conflict currently is as it relates to retail supply chain operations?
Yeah, I mean, we continue to ask our members about the impacts they're seeing from the conflict, whether it's impact of ability to get product, out of the region, what's happening with vessels, what congestion issues they're facing, if they're seeing cargo being offloaded in other places and not arriving. Um, we haven't heard a lot of major impacts from members as of yet. I think their biggest concern right now are the fuel costs
Hmm.
and what's happening not just on kind of the ocean freight side of it, because obviously the carriers are trying to put in place different bunker fuel surcharges and recap some of the expenses that they're facing. But as you noted, the impact on diesel, impact on domestic trucking, as diesel certainly has kind of skyrocketed as of recent. So I think many of our members continue to work with their transportation providers, trying to address some of those issues. Obviously, a lot of these are contractual issues.
Hmm.
They have those clauses within the contracts that deal with the kind of bunker fuel and things like that. So I think right now they're all working with the carriers to work through those issues. Certainly, they want to make sure that the carriers aren't kind of double dipping on some of these costs. We've
Hmm.
certainly appreciated some of the work the FMC has done, Chairman DeVella, and refraining from carriers being able to move too early on collecting some of these surcharges. Where if you look back, what happened during kind of the Red Sea a few years ago, when the carriers asked for expedited implementation of these fees, they got it without question. Now the commission is paying a little more attention and asking for additional details on how those fees are being calculated and how they're going to be used, which we appreciate.
Yeah, 100%. Um, this question, John, uh, at least part of it kind of goes back to our tariff conversation, and that just simply um, has to do with ways in which retail supply chain shippers are sort of navigating various surcharges, with fuel as a good example, and other things too, like the trade policy uncertainty. It's just been, it feel like in some ways, especially from the shipper perspective, it's really been one hit after another. When they get off the mat and dust themselves off, it seems like there's another challenge just staring them in the face, ready to go a few rounds, if you will. Um, what are ways in which they're sort of collecting themselves and facing a challenge head on and then getting ready for the next challenge that is sure to be around the corner.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like it's one hit after another, and you think you get out of the woods, and something else drops.
Yeah.
So I think again, looking back over the past 5 or 6 years, again, it's been kind of one thing after the next hitting the supply chain, whether it was trade policy decisions here, geopolitical situations, earthquakes, floods, whatever. Something's kind of coming around the bend. And I think one of the things that our members, NRF members, have really been focusing in on is how to plan and prepare and be ready for kind of what's next. And I think part of that comes kind of from the top down approach, where supply chain, back in the day really wasn't kind of a C-suite discussion
Hmm.
up until recently. So now having the commitment from the C-suite on putting the resources towards supply chain, towards redundancy, towards resiliency, and giving folks what they need has been incredibly important for folks to recognize, how important the supply chain is. It's more than just getting the product to the store shelf, but recognizing all the steps that are there from from the beginning, with picking who your vendors are going to be and having that all work together. So to have, constant contact and discussion internally on what your goals and priorities are when it comes to the supply chain, make sure everybody's aligned, and then pushing that back out to your vendors, whether it's your product vendors, your service suppliers, your transportation partners, so that when these events do occur, is aligned and kind of knows what to expect and how to address some of these issues. Now, granted, you can't plan for everything, but at least having the processes in place to have those communications is incredibly important. Looking at all these different kind of disruptions that happen, and looking at things like cyber as well. Cyber is another important part here. We've had numerous cyber attacks on the supply chain, and that certainly had an impact on
Yes.
folks. So recognizing kind of the enterprise-wide risk that's there in supply chain and making sure everybody's aligned on how to address it when it happens, but
Hmm.
planning for that uncertainty, something that I think is incredibly important. And again, because we all know something's coming next, we don't know what it is, but you've got to be prepared and ready to go for that what if scenario.
No, no question about it. And you had mentioned cyber there, John, in terms of the cyber attacks on supply chain. Very interesting
Mm-hmm.
topic and unfortunate topic, obviously. Also, in the news a lot has been the topic of cargo theft, freight
Yes.
fraud, etc. And that's something I forgot to put on our outline, so I apologize. But how does NRF view what's happening there? What steps can retail shippers, for example, take to lessen or alleviate their exposure to fraud or theft?
Sure. So this, the issue of cargo theft is one that's been around for a while, and we see this as part of the bigger trend on organized retail crime that we see, which is more than just kind of it's not shoplifting. It's more kind of coordinated efforts to steal products, sell them for a profit, and use those profits for other more nefarious crimes. We've seen the attacks increase in store, in warehouses, attacking the supply chain through the financial networks. So
Hmm.
this is something we've been spending a lot of time on. We actually have a bill in Congress, the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act, which we think
Yes.
is a good first step to helping address that. It has over 200 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House, close to 45 bipartisan co-sponsors in the Senate. We've had great hearings. It's gotten through the House Judiciary Committee, and we expect a potential House floor vote in mid-May.
Oh,
And
great.
essentially, what this bill would do would be create a organized retail and supply chain crime center under Homeland Security investigations and pull in all the different relevant agencies from FBI, Customs, Postal, ATF, DEA, DOT to really kind of work through this, because these crimes aren't limited to where they occur. They don't just happen in one jurisdiction. They're happening across city lines, county lines, state lines, and international boundaries. So what we need is the center to help put it all together, show the big picture, and help provide resources for state and local law enforcement to go after these bigger fish and go after the bigger criminals. A lot of this is being directed by criminal organizations outside the United States, transnational criminal organizations. So hopefully this effort allows us to put more money and effort into going after those organized rings. because we're seeing not just a rise in theft of product, but a rise in violence tied to some of these activities as well, which actually puts
Yeah.
our associates at risk, our customers at risk, and our partners at risk. And I think for retailers, it's not only just working internally on some of these issues, but working closely with their transportation providers, especially on kind of the cargo theft side, and making sure they're using legitimate drivers and legitimate companies for transportation purposes. There's a lot on the freight fraud and double brokering and things like that need to be addressed.
No, 100%. And just to wrap up, I was just curious, John, about the impact or effect of AI on retail supply chains. Are you seeing anything from your members in terms of ways they're leveraging it from an operational or throughput perspective or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody's having the AI discussion now. If you had been at
Yeah,
the NRF Big Show back in January, it was all about AI
yeah,
in kind of every aspect of retail. Folks are looking at it from HR to supply chain to kind of the sourcing perspective. But I think retailers are being careful on how they move forwards on utilizing AI. Certainly, it's a huge buzzword now, but they want to make sure that whatever they're testing and eventually putting in place actually solves kind of the challenges that they're looking for and helps make them more efficient and productive moving forward. So I think there's a lot of talk, a lot of buzz out there about AI, but I think retailers are trying to be careful as to how they implement to make sure it actually fits into the challenge they're trying to address and is actually a worthwhile solution.
yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned that it was a big topic at your conference, your trade show in January. I feel like that's a sort of a blanket way of describing every trade show in logistics over the last 6 to 9 months, anyhow, right?
Pretty
Uh,
much, yes.
AI gets it's such a prevalent spot at the table these days, next to its friend tariffs. Um, yeah, so look, John, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast. So. On behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd just like to say thanks for joining us again for what I believe is the fourth time. So you're in a pretty prestigious club there with the multiple return visits to the pod. So for that, we thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for those of you on LinkedIn, please feel free to go check John out there. He's always got a lot of good posts. It's just linkedin.com/IN/Jonathan dash gold dash 1217012 And also, you can find John on Twitter at John Gold DC, JONGOLD DC. And also check out NRF News on Twitter as well, simply at NRF News. We here at Logistics Management are also on Twitter. That's at Logistics MGMT. So please feel free to go ahead and give us a follow. And if you're not signed up for the Logistics Management Podcast, I encourage you to do so. Just go wherever you get your podcast and punch in the Logistics Management Podcast, and it will come right up for you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. We'll catch up with you next time.